Monday morning at St. Bellamy began with a cold stream of light shining through the hallway windows in Wing D. The air in the hospital was always clinically clean, up to every standard, but never warm. It wasn't the chill of air conditioning. It was the dull, quiet cold that came from how people here looked at one another, or didn't look at all. They walked fast, spoke correctly, smiled just enough, and had no time to wonder who was mopping the floor beneath their feet. An elderly woman in a brown headscarf, her back slightly hunched, clocked in at 5:58 a.m. On her uniform was a faded ID badge reading Linda M. with a smudged line, "Facilities Team, Night Shift." She pulled a janitor card in through the side entrance. In one hand, she gripped a bottle of disinfectant tightly, and her steps were slow but steady. Each one felt like it had been taken 1,000 times before. But today, a new security guard on the morning shift stopped her at the administrative wing. "Stop! You're not allowed in this area without a high-level clearance badge," he said, eyes still fixed on his phone screen. Linda paused, looked up gently, her eyes showing no surprise. "I've cleaned this wing for nearly 4 years," she said softly. "Do you have this week's clearance letter?" The guard interrupted, not loud but full of authority. Linda said nothing more. She quietly stepped back and turned toward the rear entrance of the outpatient wing. There was no argument. No one came to her defense. No one noticed. As she mopped along the hallway by the emergency department, 2 young nurses passed by her like she was a lamppost. One said, "That cleaning lady last night didn't even wipe the vomit in 3B. I had to call 3 times. The other scoffed, "Those people just do enough not to get fired." Linda heard every word but didn't turn around. She only tightened her grip slightly on the mop handle. That was the 5th time that week she'd been spoken about like some faulty piece of hospital equipment. At the corner of the admin corridor, a young man in a white coat rushed by. That was Dr. Jaden Wu, a resident who had been at St. Bellamy for 6 months. The kind who didn't stand out, didn't speak loudly, often took a step back during crowded meetings. But today he stopped when he saw Linda crouched, cleaning right under the duty board. He nodded, smiled gently, and said, "Thanks for keeping everything tidy every day, Ms. Linda." Linda paused. She looked up, and her eyes warmed for just a moment. "It's nothing, doctor. You're the only one who said that today." Jaden smiled, slightly embarrassed. "Really?" he asked, and Linda just chuckled softly. Then she went back to mopping the rest of the corridor, slowly, as if erasing the footprints of a day in which she'd never really existed. At noon, Linda was asked to clean the 3rd-floor administrative conference room after a board meeting. As she carefully picked up torn bits of paper around the podium, head nurse Megan Carter walked in. Her eyes scanned the room, irritated, as if looking for a reason. "What are you doing in here?" Megan asked sharply. "I was assigned this morning by facilities management," Linda replied calmly, without looking her in the eye. Megan folded her arms. "I don't see any confirmation slip. You shouldn't be in here without admin staff present. This time I'll let it slide. Next time I won't." Linda bowed her head. "I understand." No excuses. No one to back her up. Only a slightly crooked microphone on the podium and the sideways glances of a few young staff still packing up after the meeting. 15 minutes later, a senior doctor named Harrow entered the room. Known for being efficient but cold, he once gave a keynote about how hospitals should eliminate emotional variables from operations. Linda was now wiping down the AV control panel when he said loudly, "You there, step aside. If you're done cleaning, then leave. No need to loiter." Linda quietly shifted aside. He moved forward, flipped through a binder on the table, and didn't look at her again. That afternoon, as the shift was winding down, a nurse realized she had left her patient charts in room 3C and called security to unlock it. The guard fumbled. He didn't know the updated passcode. Linda, standing nearby, silently observed. She stepped forward, tapped twice on the keypad, and entered a code. The door opened. "How did you know the code?" the nurse asked suspiciously. Linda didn't answer. She only said, "They haven't updated it since Monday's panel replacement." Whispers began to spread about the cleaning lady who knew security codes. Some laughed. Some began to whisper, "Who is she? How long has she been here?" Most still didn't care. In the small break room for support staff, Linda removed her headscarf, washed her hands, and looked in the mirror. Her face showed deep lines around the eyes, but her gaze was still clear. On the old wooden wall, taped with yellowed adhesive, was a black and white photo. Young doctors and nurses standing in front of the hospital as it was being built. She stared at the photo for a long time, then gently straightened it. No one saw. No one knew that among those in the picture, only she still walked into this hospital every single day. Her name didn't matter, because no one ever asked. No one thought a janitor could carry the memory of an entire building. No one believed the same hands holding that mop had once held a stethoscope, had once signed the founding papers, had once written the very first mission statement for a healthcare system that no longer recognized her. But Linda wasn't angry. She had never been angry. She only waited, because she knew what mattered wasn't who saw her, but when the time came, this entire system would have to look at itself. The Tuesday night shift began like any other, except tonight. The hallway in Section A was leaking due to a burst AC pipe from the upper floor. Linda was redirected to the inpatient ward to assist with cleanup, even though it wasn't her assigned shift. She arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a worn-out plumbing repair kit that no one in the cleaning crew used anymore. It was so old that nobody realized the tools inside had once been personally redesigned by her back in the 90s, when the hospital still relied more on manual tools than today's automated systems. While she was drying the floor and placing warning signs, an elderly patient wandered from the geriatric unit into the post-surgery recovery wing. The old man looked disoriented, his hands trembling as he gripped the bedrail and struggled to open a door that was locked by an automatic system. Linda spotted him from afar, set down her mop and walked quickly toward him. "Mr. James," she called softly. The man looked up, his cloudy eyes blinking rapidly. "I'm looking for the minor procedure room. He stammered. Linda gently placed one hand on his arm, and the other reached for the ID bracelet on his wrist. She quickly read the medical info and treatment history. "It's all right, Mr. James. You're from the geriatric unit, room 2B. I'll take you back," she said, guiding him down the hallway. But as they neared the staff break room, a sharp voice rang out. "What are you doing?" Megan Carter appeared with a thick file in her hand, eyes darting between Linda and the old man. "He got lost. I was just helping him get back to his room," Linda answered calmly. Megan stepped forward, her voice louder. "You are not a nurse. You're not authorized to touch patients, let alone escort them anywhere." Linda slowly let go of Mr. James's arm, saying nothing. The old man began trembling, unsure of what was going on. "I've worked here for many years. I know where he belongs," Linda said. Megan crossed her arms, her eyes full of suspicion. "That's not the point. This is a serious violation. Next time, alert the on-duty staff immediately. Don't take matters into your own hands. I won't report this to administration, for now, but I will log it into the system." Linda nodded, then turned away. Mr. James looked after her, whispering, She saved me back in 2004. I remember," but no one heard him, and Megan certainly didn't care to. Linda returned to her work area, recharging the floor scrubber and sitting on the wooden bench near the fire exit. She opened a small lunchbox, plain rice and vegetable soup. In the corner, a nursing intern named Aisha, 22 years old, dark-skinned, hair tied up, was typing on a laptop and watching Linda through a mirror's reflection. "Did you really know that old man?" Aisha asked quietly. Linda didn't turn, only said, "I did. I gave him an injection right after his heart surgery." Aisha froze. "Were you a nurse?" Linda smiled but gave no answer. "You should have been a doctor," Aisha whispered. Linda still said nothing. A moment passed and then she gently replied, like wind brushing past an old wall. "Sometimes people don't need to know who you are, as long as you remember who you are." The shift went on. Around 3 a.m., while checking the auxiliary surgical wing, Linda noticed an unusual buzzing from the air filtration system. She wrote down the error code, placed a warning sign, and submitted a report through the internal software. Something no one thought she even knew how to do. The next morning, a technician inspected the system and found that if the issue had gone unresolved for 3 more days, it could have compromised the sterile air system. The only person who flagged the error was Linda, but the report got filed under internal suggestion Non-priority. No one brought it up. No thank you was ever given. By the end of the week, Linda was reassigned to clean the executive boardroom after a director summit. The room still smelled faintly of coffee and expensive perfume. As she was mopping near the podium, a sheet of paper fell from the table. It was the next quarter's budget allocation. A red circle in pen marked a line. Reduce HR funding by 18%, starting with service, sanitation, and logistics. Linda stared at that line for a long time. She picked the sheet up, placed it back in position, and continued cleaning the floor. That evening, as Linda was leaving, Jaden stood waiting in the hallway. "Ms. Linda," he called, "yesterday I read an old medical journal article, a study on geriatric patient care in tropical regions. The author was L.M. Bellamy. Any relation to you?" Linda paused. Her eyes narrowed slightly as though someone had just spoken the name of an old memory. "Could be," she replied. "Could be not." Jaden looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Either way, I'm glad you're here. I've learned a lot from the quiet ones." Linda smiled and gently placed her hand on his shoulder. Sometimes to understand a system, you have to listen to the voices it forgot. That night, when everyone else had gone, Linda returned to the storage room. She opened an old wooden cabinet in the back, covered in dust and scattered papers. In the dark corner lay a small metal box. She opened it. Inside was a name tag, Dr. Linda May Bellamy, co-founder, St. Bellamy Hospital. She stared at it for a long while, then closed it. No one knew who she used to be, but she was still here, and everything was just beginning. On Wednesday, the hospital held an internal training session for resident doctors on the integrated post-op monitoring system. A portion of the class took place in the technical room on the 5th floor, home to models of air filtration systems, ventilators, and simulated control panels for emergency procedure drills. Linda was assigned to clean the area after the session ended. She arrived 15 minutes early out of habit, quietly observing as young doctors clustered into groups, taking notes, debating, and occasionally checking their phones as the instructor spoke. When the engineer began simulating an air filtration error in the negative pressure room, Linda stood just outside the glass door, her hand resting gently on the frame. She furrowed her brow when she saw them input pressure settings that were not suitable for elderly patients. No one noticed, but in that moment, her expression looked like someone trying hard not to speak out. Then Harrow's voice rang out from behind her. "Why are you standing here? This isn't your area." Linda turned. Harrow was walking with a newly hired medical supervisor named Shaw, recently transferred from Chicago. Linda replied calmly, "I've been assigned to clean this area after the simulation." Harrow glanced at his watch. "It's still 20 minutes from ending. Why are you standing here? Trying to understand a bit of how these machines work?" Shaw scoffed. Harrow continued more clearly, "People like you should remember, barefoot folks don't touch circuit boards." Linda didn't react. She met Harrow's eyes for a solid 3 seconds, then nodded. "I'll come back later." And she walked away. Not quickly, not shakily, but with enough steadiness that even Shaw paused in the silence she left behind. That afternoon, Jaden carried a folder into the medical records archive. While searching for patient files, he came across a residency training manual from 2001. On the first page was a hand-drawn diagram signed Dr. L.M. Bellamy, head of training. He flipped through it quickly. Every schematic, every system function diagram, ventilator operations, emergency response, mirrored what he had just learned that morning. But this edition was from 2001. Someone had written today's knowledge 2 decades ago. Jaden rushed to the break room in the logistics wing. Linda was folding blankets, prepping for her night shift. He placed the manual on the table. "I found this." Linda looked at him, not surprised. "You wrote this, didn't you?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately, nor did she deny it. "I used to write a lot of things, but not everyone reads them." Jaden sat across from her. "Who are you?" It was the first time he asked directly. Linda simply smiled as she always did. "I used to be part of this place, like a brick inside the wall. Still there, just painted over." That evening, while cleaning the administrative wing, Linda passed a wall displaying portraits of former hospital leaders. In the bottom left corner was a missing frame. Just the wooden border remained, no photo inside. She stopped, gently touched the empty frame. A thin layer of dust clung to her fingertip. She didn't wipe it off, just left it and walked on. The next day, the ICU air pressure monitoring system triggered an unusual warning. A team of engineers was called, but they couldn't find the issue. Linda happened to walk by and saw them mishandling the joint between the return air tube and the central unit. She paused and tapped lightly on the glass. If you rotate the joint clockwise instead of counterclockwise, the pressure will stabilize. One of the engineers laughed out loud. Thanks, but we need real professional input. She said nothing. 5 minutes later, after failing to fix it, they tried her suggestion. The alert vanished, but no one turned back to thank her. One person muttered, "Weird. Must have been a fluke." And they moved on. The whispers grew, about the woman who knew more about machinery than the engineers, who called patients by name without needing a file, who got called barefoot, but whom the machines seemed to obey. Megan heard the whispers. Harrow heard them too. And Jaden, he was the only one trying to piece the clues together. One afternoon, Jaden was invited to a planning meeting with Dr. Shaw and Harrow about improving inpatient care protocols. During the meeting, Harrow brought up the need to remove elements that don't align with a modern medical image. Shaw laughed loudly. Like those old ladies wandering the halls thinking they're Florence Nightingale? Everyone chuckled, except Jaden. After the meeting, he returned to the logistics wing and saw Linda rinsing out sanitizer containers under a tap. He spoke, not loudly, not softly. "I'm sorry, on behalf of those who think they know everything." Linda looked up and smiled. "You don't need to apologize. People like you, still asking questions, are the ones who can change something." That night in the old storage room, Linda opened a moldy document box. Inside were hand-drawn blueprints of the hospital system, early administrative plans. One note read, "Transfer of operational authority, medical leave, do not publicize." She stared at that line for a long time. That decision had erased her name from the system nearly a decade ago. A quiet decision. No announcement, no protest. Because she was no longer around to speak up. She had simply been forgotten, systematically. But now she was back. Not for revenge, but to see if the system she once built was still capable of hearing the truth. On Thursday afternoon, the air monitoring system in ICU room A7 suddenly issued a pressure alert. The warning appeared on the central control screen, a rare type of error, one that only occurred when there was prolonged pressure imbalance between two adjacent rooms using outdated ventilator equipment. Most staff didn't understand the root cause, assuming it was a false alarm. Harrow was called in. He arrived with the hospital's chief biomedical engineer, a man named Vern, large-framed, silver-haired, and built like he'd just walked out of a gym. "It's probably a sensor glitch," Vern concluded. "This system's still not fully synced." Harrow nodded. "Shut it down. Report it to compliance later. Leave the machines running. The patient is stable." Linda was cleaning the adjacent ICU wing. She heard everything but didn't interrupt. Once they left, she entered the technical room. On the control panel, the pressure numbers were still fluctuating. Her face shifted subtly, from calm to focused. She opened the emergency equipment cabinet, the kind only technicians were authorized to access, and temporarily replaced part of the air filter with an auxiliary converter. Her movements weren't rushed, but they were precise, like someone following a sequence she had memorized by heart. 12 minutes later, the pressure reading stabilized. No one noticed, except for a young nurse named Michael, who had come back to retrieve the phone he'd left behind. Standing outside the glass door, he witnessed the entire procedure. When Linda stepped out, he asked quietly, "What were you doing in there?" Linda simply smiled, helping the system breathe easier. Michael frowned, but didn't press further. There was something about her answer that sent a chill down his spine. Not fear, but the unsettling feeling of having seen something he couldn't quite explain. 3 hours later, Harrow returned to inspect the issue after receiving a follow-up request from the ICU head. "The alert's gone?" he asked. The engineer confirmed. "No idea who resolved it. It's just gone. Might have auto-reset." Harrow nodded. "Good. I told you it wasn't serious." He turned to leave. then noticed Linda wiping down the glass in the hallway. He paused and said in a firm but measured tone, "You don't need to pretend you understand this stuff. If you touch any machine without clearance, you'll be fired. This is healthcare, not a guessing game." Linda didn't reply. She simply turned her gaze through the glass toward the ICU, and for one split second, her eyes were no longer those of a janitor. They were the eyes of someone who had once led surgical teams, who had once saved hundreds of lives, who had once been erased from the very system she helped build. That night, Michael told Aisha, the intern, what he had seen, Linda fixing the pressure system. Aisha wasn't surprised. She knows everything. Just the other day, she taught me how to check the IV line without removing it. Michael sighed. The problem is, no one believes it. Aisha nodded. Because everyone already decided who she is, and that's all they care to know. In an empty hallway, Linda unlocked an old steel door that led to a long-forgotten medical equipment room. She flipped the light on using a mechanical switch, the kind she had personally installed in 1997. The room was filled with components from an older system the hospital no longer used, but Linda remembered every screw, every weld. She walked to a corner, removed a dust-covered cloth, and revealed a hand-drawn electrical blueprint, the original schematic of the hospital's internal air system, once drafted by her own hand. It was still mounted on the wall. No one dared take it down, unsure if doing so would violate some obscure safety regulation. In the top corner, written in black ink, were the words L.M. Bellamy, Prototype V1. She touched the signature gently. The ink had faded, but it was still legible. Meanwhile, in the director's office, Megan and Harrow were discussing staffing adjustments for the upcoming year. Megan said, "I just received feedback about Linda being in restricted areas and operating equipment without authorization." Harrow frowned. "I've said this before. People like her think they're special. Tomorrow, I'm moving her shift to the basement. Technical support wing." Megan nodded. "We should end this quietly." Harrow added, "I don't need some barefoot old woman stirring things up. Let her mop the floors and forget whatever she used to be." That comment wasn't just dismissive. It was a tactic, an institutional method of erasure. The system had once removed Linda by pretending she didn't exist, by treating her knowledge as disruption, and by never asking how she knew so much. But this time, Linda wouldn't vanish quietly. Not with yelling, not with confrontation, but by letting the system reveal its own blind spots. One misstep at a time, one machine at a time, one oversight at a time. She didn't need anyone to know who she was. But when the system began to drift away from the blueprint she once drew, she would be the only one left who remembered exactly where every wire once ran. Jaden wasn't the kind of person who poked around out of sheer curiosity. He was a doctor, and like every good doctor, he had learned early on in med school not to jump to conclusions. But something about Linda triggered that clinical instinct in him, a faint anomaly in a test result, small enough to overlook, but dangerous if ignored. He couldn't stop replaying the way she moved through the technical zones as if she'd lived there, the times she warned of system issues that no one believed, and the way her eyes lingered on places others never thought to notice. That afternoon, after completing his rounds and documentation, Jaden wandered down the hospital's north corridor, a seldom-used wing of the old facility. The hallway was long, painted a faded beige, with occasional picture frames stained by time. At the end stood a frosted glass door leading to a room labeled Legacy Room, a space meant to preserve photos and mementos from when the hospital was still a small state-run nonprofit. There was no guard, no lock. Nearly no one ever went in anymore. Jaden stepped inside. The room smelled of aged wood, dimly lit by yellow bulbs. Black and white photographs lined the walls. The first medical team, the groundbreaking ceremony, phases of construction, the original equity board. He scanned frame after frame. Every image had names inscribed underneath, except one large photo at the center. That photo had clearly been altered. The upper left section bore a gap, and the cropped edges didn't quite match. Jaden leaned in. The subjects were all medical staff in lab coats, standing before the half-built hospital structure. A tall woman with a stethoscope stood just left of center, unnamed. Even stranger, the caption below listed, "Co-founder, position temporarily vacant, identity unconfirmed." He stepped back. A strange chill ran up his spine. Why would a founder be erased? And why did that woman's stance look exactly like Linda's when she mopped the hallways? At that same moment, Linda was down in the technical wing, recently scheduled for full sterilization. She wore simple protective gear and a mask, but still had on her old shoes, the same pair she'd worn during her medical residency. While cleaning near the obsolete electrical bay, she noticed a portion of wall behind a steel cabinet where the brickwork had flaked. She gently brushed away the debris, revealing a small bronze plaque hidden behind the wall. It read, "To LMB, for building this place with hands and heart." No one remembered this plaque ever existing. No one knew when it had been sealed away. But Linda knew. That evening, Jaden brought a printout from the legacy room to show Aisha. "Look at this person," he said, pointing to the woman with no name. Aisha looked up, eyes wide. "She looks just like Linda." Jaden nodded. "I think it is her." Aisha whispered, "Why was her name erased?" Jaden replied, "I don't know, but I'm going to find out." Meanwhile, Megan received a memo from HR. Linda M., no original employee ID on file. Seems to be a special shift reinstatement worker. No medical history before 2015. No training records on record. Megan narrowed her eyes. "What's this about?" she asked. The HR staffer replied, "Could be a lost file during the database transition, or she may have been part of the old system." Megan smirked. "The old system has no value." She crumpled the paper and tossed it in the trash. But just outside her office door, Linda happened to walk by. She didn't hear every word, but she heard enough. The next day, Jaden returned to the legacy room, this time carrying a photocopy from an old medical journal he had found at the local library. It contained an article by Dr. L.M. Bellamy, alongside a photo of the author, a woman standing in front of the very same commemorative wall, but before it had been altered. The image matched perfectly. Jaden stood silently. There was no doubt left. Linda was the one, deliberately forgotten. But he didn't tell anyone yet, because he knew if he was right, then the erased name wasn't just a person, it was a part of the hospital's soul. Meanwhile, Linda returned to her break room after her shift. She opened her bag and pulled out an old file folder, yellowed with age, its corners curled. Inside were the original hospital blueprints, the founder's list, and handwritten administrative plans she had drafted herself. On the back of one page in faint ink were the words, "If the day comes when they forget who I was, let them see who never forgot who they were." Linda folded the file. She didn't know what Jaden was searching for, but she knew whoever uncovered the truth first, the time was drawing near. On Monday morning, the conference room on the 6th floor was locked early in preparation for the hospital's Q3 strategic leadership meeting. Outside, logistics staff were ordered to clean thoroughly, but strictly vacate the area before 7:45 a.m. Linda was assigned to the front lobby zone. She arrived on time, working quietly as always. But that day, the automatic floor cleaner suddenly got tangled near the corner, adjacent to the maintenance door, right beside the main HVAC control room, which shared a one-way glass wall with the executive meeting room. Linda bent down to untangle the cable, but instead of walking away, she remained by the corner wall, where the marble floor reflected a dim outline of her face in the glass. From that angle, she couldn't hear every word, but enough to piece together the essence of the meeting. Inside, Harrow was presenting a plan titled Non-Medical Support Staff Streamlining, a proposal to cut 22% of logistics, janitorial, and technical staff within 60 days. "We need a hospital that looks modern, efficient, and tech-forward," he said. "Emotional relics, or leftovers from the old model, need to be dealt with." Megan nodded. "We've already compiled a target list. Some of them have internal complaint records. For example, Linda M., custodial staff, has repeatedly entered technical zones unauthorized, tampering with equipment." Shaw scoffed. "Is that the one who keeps lurking around like she used to run the place?" "I know that type. Role delusion. If no one draws the line, they'll keep pushing." Linda stood still. She didn't flinch, didn't step back. She simply listened, every word like an old blade finding its old scar. Harrow continued, "The issue is, people like her become the wrong kind of symbol. When a support staffer believes she can voice opinions on medical operations, we lose hierarchy. We lose discipline. A male voice at the end of the table asked, "But has she actually done anything wrong?" Megan replied, "No major violations, but her presence undermines the professional atmosphere." A pause, then Harrow concluded, "Agreed. Starting next week, move Linda to the basement janitorial shift. Revoke access to technical zones. Also terminate the probation contract. She doesn't need to be here anymore." Linda didn't move. She didn't cry. No tears. But something in her gaze cracked, not from the words themselves, but from their familiarity, as if the entire system was repeating what it had once done to her, now in more polite language, but with the same goal: remove, ignore, exile. The meeting ended. Executives filed out. Megan stepped into the hall first and saw Linda mopping the floor just a few meters away. She was startled. "You're still here?" Linda looked up. "I haven't finished this area." Megan frowned. "You're not supposed to be near the conference room while the meeting is in session." Linda put down the mop, standing up straight. "I know." Megan lowered her voice. "Then why are you still here?" Linda gave a faint smile, almost a reflex of self-preservation. "Because I used to be part of meetings like this. I know that when people start discussing someone who isn't in the room, it means the plan was already in motion." Megan froze. For a brief second, her eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty, but then she turned away, saying nothing more. That night, Linda returned to the old equipment storage room and quietly opened the steel box containing the hospital's original founding plans. She flipped through the pages until she reached the section on personnel stratification, where she had once written the very first note on equal feedback rights for every system member. That line had since been removed by her successors from the current operational handbook. She underlined it again with fresh ink. If feedback becomes a nuisance, the system is no longer a system. It has become a pyramid. At the same time, Jaden sat in the library, reviewing all archived documents. He was connecting the dots, from the unnamed photo, the redacted Bellamy records, to the old medical journal article. One question kept looping in his mind. If Linda was truly the founder, why would she return as a janitor? And the only answer he could come up with was, because only by starting again from the system's lowest rung could she truly see where it had gone wrong. The next day, Linda was reassigned to the technical sublevel. The space was cold, damp, windowless, but she didn't complain. She began her new shift by inspecting each steam valve, each emergency exit, as if she still owned every square inch of the building. No one spoke to her. No one noticed her. And that was exactly what she needed, because in the shadows the truth was growing, and this time it wouldn't be buried beneath an administrative decision. On Friday, the hospital's main auditorium was prepared for the Q3 Operational Reform Review, an annual event used by the executive board to present improvement metrics and future personnel strategies. The room was filled with department heads, lead physicians, and senior management. A large LED screen ran welcome slides, and rows of chairs were lined up perfectly. Everything was designed to showcase modernity and optimize governance. No support staff were invited. Linda's name wasn't on the list either. She knew that, but she came, not as an intruder, but as someone the space itself had grown used to since the beginning. She entered from the back technical door, a brown scarf covering her graying hair, holding a slim folder in her hands. No one noticed. Everyone was still focused on Megan presenting a budget cut proposal for lower-tier staff, which included a recommendation to eliminate functionally unnecessary roles to preserve the hospital's national standard image. Harrow stepped up immediately after, his voice loud and confident. "Our mission is to lead not just in medicine, but in management. It's time for the hospital to transform, to have the courage to cut what no longer fits. Departments like logistics, janitorial, technical, it's time to restructure, automate more, and streamline further." Jaden sat in the middle row. In his hand was a photocopied image from the legacy room, the photo with the name erased. He looked at the stage, then at the document, then around the room. He couldn't see Linda anywhere, but something in his gut, that same instinct that had once saved a patient in their final moment, told him she was near. And then, like a scene in slow motion, the back technical door opened. Every eye turned. A woman stepped in. Not fast, not loud, not dramatic. Linda. The skylight above cast a beam onto her worn shoes, which glimmered faintly on the polished floor. She wasn't wearing a uniform. She wore a gray coat with a frayed collar, holding a file folder and an old tarnished ID badge around her neck. A security guard approached. "Ma'am, support staff are not allowed in this area during conferences." Linda didn't respond. She looked straight at the stage. Her voice wasn't loud, but it rang out, clear and strong. "I'm not support staff. I'm part of the reason this building exists." The entire auditorium fell silent. Jaden stood up. Megan frowned. Harrow leaned forward slightly, not believing his eyes. Linda took another step. She raised her hand. The ID badge, old and bronze with one bent corner, read, "Dr. Linda May Bellamy, co-founder, medical systems lead." Everything stopped. The air thickened. Those who had once pushed her out of the system, who had called her just a floor worker, now stared at her like she had just walked out of an old photograph they'd forgotten once hung in the center of the room. Linda raised her head. She didn't smile. Her voice remained steady, as if reciting the very first sentence she had written in the founding manifesto of the hospital. A healthcare system is not built with budgets. It is built with hands, with minds, and with compassion. She paused a moment. And I was the one who wrote those first lines, in a room with no ceiling lights, no projector, just a chalkboard and 12 wooden chairs. Megan stood up. "You can't just walk in here and—" Linda raised her hand. "I don't need to just walk in. I hold 31.7% operational ownership of this hospital, still valid under the 1998 agreement, never revoked." She held up the ownership certificate in front of the conference projector. The system automatically cast it onto the screen behind the stage. Jaden held his breath. No one made a sound. An older doctor in the front row muttered, "Bellamy, that's her?" Linda turned to him. "You were a resident in 2000, weren't you? I remember you missed a shift because your father passed. I was the one who signed your emergency leave." The memories flooded back. Linda lowered the file. She stepped into the center of the auditorium. Her voice never wavered. "I didn't come back to reclaim a title. I don't need that. I came back because when I saw the system I helped build slowly, forget why it existed in the first place. I couldn't stay silent." She looked at Harrow. "When you talk about optimization, you forget that the first thing we ever promised was never to optimize away dignity. When you talk about removing what's unnecessary, I ask, is compassion still necessary?" No one answered. Jaden walked toward her, silently handing her a training manual from 2001. This was yours, right?" Linda looked at him, nodded. "Thank you, not for keeping it, but for reading it." She looked around the room. "I never left this hospital. I just disappeared from your sight. But I'm still here. Every day. You just didn't see me." Silence. Total silence. No one dared to applaud. No one dared to object. They simply sat there, face to face with someone they had all assumed no longer existed. After Linda's declaration, the room no longer felt like a conference hall. It felt like a stage whose artificial backdrop had just been torn apart. The people seated in the auditorium no longer knew where to place themselves, because the woman they once saw as a janitor now stood in the light, holding the very identity they had buried. Megan lowered her face into her folder. Harrow stood still, frozen like a statue. Jaden, still holding the old notebook, stood beside Linda. But the look in his eyes no longer belonged to a medical resident. It was the gaze of a witness, someone who would tell what he had seen. Linda didn't retreat. She stood tall, facing the entire room. But instead of continuing with criticism or confrontation, she softened her tone, unexpectedly. "I didn't come here to sue anyone," she said, prompting several people to look up, surprised. "I don't want to see you fired, exposed, or have your careers ruined. If that had been my goal, I would have done it 10 years ago, when I was removed from the system with a forged medical notice. I had enough evidence to take it to court, but I didn't." Megan looked up, her voice trembling. "Then, what do you want?" Linda didn't look at her. She looked toward the back rows. where nameless staff usually sat. Young nurses, night shift technicians, the ones who cleaned windows and changed sheets. She raised the folder in her hand. I want this hospital to remember why it was built. Not for profit, not for prestige, but for every patient who ever lay in these beds, and for every staff member who kept this place running in silence. Jaden stepped up to the presentation desk. He connected the projector and opened an old scanned PDF file from the internal system. On the screen appeared the words, Respect at Every Level, Proposed Policy, 1999, by Dr. Linda Bellamy. A few in the room widened their eyes. I've never seen this policy, someone whispered. Linda nodded. Because it was withdrawn after I was removed, but I kept the original. She pointed at the content on the screen. In this proposal, I required that all employees, from physicians to custodial staff, undergo regular human-centered training. I proposed that every shift include at least one cross-level dialogue per quarter. I insisted that cameras not only monitor misconduct but preserve acts of kindness. Harrow leaned forward. That's idealistic, but not practical under current operational conditions. Linda turned to him. Not practical, or just inconvenient for your control? The question sliced the air like a pair of shears. Linda lowered her voice. I don't need an executive title. I don't want to return as a director. But I do want all of you to acknowledge, this hospital needs fixing. And if no one here has the courage to do it, then I'll start again with the very people you've refused to see. The auditorium was silent. Then she declared, I will reinstate the respect at every level policy. I will personally lead the first cohort. I invite Dr. Jaden Wu to serve as lead coordinator, and I require every member of the executive board, including Megan Carter and Dr. Harrow, to attend the first training as if they were new employees. Jaden looked up, stunned. Megan opened her mouth to object but couldn't utter a word. Harrow snapped, You have no authority to force us into that. Linda looked at him, not angry, just sad. I'm not forcing you, I'm inviting you. But if you refuse, then don't continue to represent a healthcare system built on compassion. Silence. Then from the back row, a small voice spoke. I'll join. It was Michael, the young nurse who had once seen Linda fixing the air filter. Then Aisha stood up. Me too. The third was an older doctor. I was once your student. I don't want to stay silent anymore. Seats shifted. Footsteps echoed softly. Linda stood among them all. She didn't raise a hand. She didn't chant a slogan. She simply stood there, like a pillar that had just been re-erected after years of chipped paint. Megan looked around, then down at her own hands. Harrow quietly packed his things and left the room without a word. Linda watched them go, without a smile. She simply turned to Jaden. Now we truly begin. 3 days after the summit, the ground floor hallway of St. Bellamy Hospital felt unfamiliar. Not because of the lighting, still the same harsh white fluorescent bulbs. Not because of the scent, still a mix of rubbing alcohol and rushed coffee, but because the people who usually stayed on upper floors were now standing in the janitor's spot. Linda opened the first session of the Respect at Every Level training program in the third-floor maintenance room, a former storage space that had been cleared out and fitted with wooden chairs arranged in a circle. There was no podium, no projector, just a whiteboard and a dry erase marker with a frayed tip. Written clearly by hand on the board were 4 words. Who are you not seeing? Linda sat in the first chair. She didn't stand, didn't introduce herself as a leader. Beside her sat Jaden, who had agreed to serve as coordinator. Scattered around them were about 10 people, from a famously stern head nurse to an aging systems engineer close to retirement. And, unexpectedly, Megan Carter showed up too. No one had invited her. No one had asked. But that morning she came, dressed in simple business clothes, carrying a notebook and a look in her eyes that Linda recognized. The look of someone who had just crossed the threshold of shame. Linda didn't start with introductions. She asked one question. Who here has ever felt invisible in this place? At first, no one raised a hand. Then Michael, the young nurse, lifted his. Me. When I first started, I once stood outside the meeting room for an hour, and no one asked what I needed. They walked past me like I was air. Isha followed. I was once scolded for wearing the wrong color medical shoes, but when a doctor wore the wrong color, no one said a word. Then a cleaner named Tamika, her voice as soft as wind, said, "A security guard once told me to step aside while I was mopping the ER floor. It was fine, but in 3 years, no one has ever asked my name." Linda nodded. "Thank you. Now let's try something different." She divided the group into pairs. One person played the doctor, one played the support staff. Each had to share with the other a time they felt hurt at work, without reacting, without justifying. Just listen. When Harrow walked into the second session, 5 minutes late, no one expected him to sit down. But he did. He didn't greet anyone, didn't apologize, just opened his notebook and wrote. When paired with Linda, he was reluctant but didn't refuse. She asked, "When was the last time you felt dismissed?" Harrow scoffed. "I'm an administrator. That doesn't happen." Linda didn't reply. She just looked at him, long enough for him to continue. "Actually, once, I proposed a small group residency model. It was shut down. Someone said, 'You're from engineering. Stay out of education.' I was angry, but I learned to stay silent." Linda nodded. "Thank you. Now you understand." After the third session, the internal bulletin began to change. A small caption appeared in every update. "Every voice has a place." In the cafeteria, the management-only seating section had its divider removed. In the main lobby, the leadership wall was updated with a restored photo, the one that had once been removed, reading, "Dr. Linda M. Bellamy, co-founder." It was Megan who proposed reinstating the photo. No one told her to. She simply sent one email to the communications department. "I think we owe her a rightful presence." As the system began to shift, there was pushback. A few department heads refused to attend the training. Some wrote protest emails calling the program a dilution of professional focus. Linda didn't respond to those emails. She kept teaching, kept listening. One day in class, she held up a handwritten note from a patient. "I don't remember the face of the nurse who cared for me that night, but I remember the voice as they touched my forehead. 'You're okay. I'm here.'" She looked up. Any one of us can be that person, if we stop tearing compassion. A week later, Harrow sent an email officially requesting to join the program as a full participant. In the reason section, he wrote just one line. "I've spent too long guarding my position, instead of making room beside me." Linda read the email but said nothing. That evening, she stayed late, alone, wiped down the whiteboard, folded chairs, stacked the first training notebooks. No one knew that inside each one, she had written a private note. Kindness is not a skill, it is memory. The 10th session was held on a Saturday morning, a time when no one expected the hospital to be doing anything beyond patient care. But Linda had chosen that day on purpose, because she knew those who show up when it's not required are the ones who have started to hear their own inner voice. On the attendance list were some of the very people who had once opposed her the most: the chief of surgery, a senior HR manager, even an internal lawyer who had once been assigned to monitor her for overstepping authority. But today they were here. They didn't know what they were going to be taught. There were no slides, no schedule, no handouts. Only a single sheet of paper in front of each of them with one line. "Today's session will be held in the basement." People were stunned. Most had never even been down there. The basement housed old utility areas, water filters, central HVAC systems, break rooms for the night shift. People often referred to broadly as maintenance or cleaning. No one said anything. They followed Linda, who led the group down the iron stairs, past a heavy door that had never once been oiled. They stepped into a dimmer space, where the air smelled damp and machines hummed low along the walls. Linda offered no explanation. She simply stopped in front of a whiteboard mounted to the wall and wrote one sentence. "When was the last time you looked a janitor in the eye?" No one spoke. She handed each person a pair of gloves and a maintenance team uniform jacket. No one laughed. No one refused. Linda divided them into teams and gave out tasks. One group to clean the basement's dust filtration unit, another to mop the hallway, and another to collect old supplies from the storage room. Each person was paired with an actual staff member. They weren't allowed to mention their titles, no ID badges, no introductions. Just work, for 3 hours, no breaks. Jaden was paired with Tamika, the quiet cleaner once treated like a shadow. Harrow was paired with a maintenance worker named Elias, a small man, his back slightly hunched from years of lifting chemical barrels. Megan went with Aisha, the former intern she had once scolded for wearing the wrong shoes. The entire basement became a classroom, but no one was teaching. 3 hours later, Linda gathered them. They sat in a circle, on dusty concrete, the scent of disinfectant still thick in the air. No papers, no microphone. Linda looked at each of them, then asked, "What did you learn?" Jaden spoke first. "I mopped floors, but Tamika taught me how to get the corners so people don't slip. I learned that sometimes we can be skilled but still wrong." Megan spoke next, her voice quiet and direct. "I used to think I was right to enforce standards, but Aisha taught me you can't see right or wrong unless you first ask why someone made the choice they did." Harrow was silent the longest. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't shaky, but it was lower than usual. "Elias has small hands, but I've never seen anyone tighten a valve like he does. I used to think only those at the top could see the system, but today I realized the ones below know where it's breaking." Linda didn't respond. She stood, erased the board, and held up an old paper, pinning it to the corner of the wall. It was the hospital's original code of conduct, handwritten with a faded signature. Dr. LMB 1999. She didn't need to explain. Everyone could read the last line. "We do not heal illness without healing the way we see each other." Then she handed each person a small envelope. No one knew what was inside. Not until they returned to their offices and opened it did they see a black and white photo printed from a basement security camera. It showed the exact moment they were kneeling to mop, or fixing equipment, or tying up a trash bag. Their faces were blurred from sweat, from being bowed down, but because of that, their faces looked a lot like Linda's from 10 years ago. Jaden pinned the photo to his office bulletin board. Megan quietly tucked it into the back of her personal notebook. Harrow hung it behind his office door, where no one else would see it, except him. That evening, Linda stayed late. She returned to the basement, alone, and wiped down every footprint left behind by the trainees. Not because she had to, but because she believed when people kneeled to learn, the floor should be clean. Not for titles, but for dignity. In the 4th week after the basement session, St. Bellamy Hospital underwent another change. One that was never announced by email, never posted on a bulletin board, never mentioned in a press release. But anyone who walked the hallway between the ICU and the admin wing noticed something different. The room at the end of the hallway, formerly a digital record storage, now had a new wooden door, hinged with bronze brackets, and an old-fashioned round handle. No one knew exactly when it had been installed, but everyone who passed by stopped, because above the door was a small bronze plaque, etched in simple script. "The Listening Room, dedicated to Dr. Linda M. Bellamy." No portrait, no biography, no title, just one line beneath it. "Because healing begins with the voices we forgot to hear." Megan was the first to step inside. No one saw her enter, but everyone saw her exit, red-eyed, holding a small note. It contained a recording of a nurse who had retired in 2008. A message of thanks to Linda for protecting her from being fired after a misunderstood medical incident. Megan had never known that had happened, and now it was there, among the fragments of memory the system had once tried to forget. Jaden came that afternoon alone, sitting near the small speaker in the room. He listened to an old conversation recorded during the hospital's founding meetings. Linda's voice speaking about janitorial staff's right to ask questions, another man's voice cutting her off, and then Linda gently saying, "If a system is afraid of being questioned, it doesn't deserve to be called a system." Jaden closed his eyes. He didn't know if anyone else was listening too, but he felt he wasn't alone. And for the first time in his medical career, he understood what it meant to be taught without being lectured. Harrow came at the end of the day. No one invited him. He walked straight into the room, stood silently in front of the bronze plaque. When he entered, he sat on the small wooden stool in the center of the room. On the table was a notebook with anonymous employee feedback. He turned to the first page, reading every line. One entry made him pause. I used to think Linda was just an odd staffer. Now I know she was the only one who ever heard our footsteps while everyone else was busy looking up. Harrow closed the notebook, stood up, and left without a word. But that evening, he sent an email to the entire surgical department. Next week, I won't be leading the meeting. I'll be listening. You speak. From then on, the listening room became a space where no one could enter as a title. The door had no card reader. Everyone had to turn the knob and push, like any regular person. Inside were chairs, recordings, and a notebook where people could write what they couldn't say aloud. Each week, a new recording would play. Voices of those who once worked at the hospital, who had left quietly, who had been pushed out of the conversation. No one was forced to listen, but everyone did, because there, no one had to perform. Linda never went back into that room. She didn't need to. To her, that door wasn't meant to be entered, but to step out of the shadows. What she needed to say, she had said. What she needed to fix, she had fixed. What remained was quiet momentum. One day, Jaden went down to the basement looking for Linda, but she wasn't there. Instead, he found a wiped clean whiteboard with only one line written in red ink. The strokes nearly faded. We don't begin with answers. We begin with who gets heard first. Next to the board was a small fabric bag on the table. Inside were training materials for the Respect at Every Level program, an old name badge, and a folded note. Jaden, I believe you'll carry this on. Not because I need you to, but because someone out there needs you the way I once needed someone. There was no farewell day, no retirement party, no ceremony. Linda disappeared from the hospital the same way she had returned, quietly, unnoticed. But she left something no one could erase again. A bronze plaque, a wooden room, and a system that had been forced to relearn how to be human. December in Chicago brings a skin-cutting cold. The snow isn't heavy, but enough to fog the hospital's transparent glass panels. In the hallway of the first floor, a Christmas tree has just been put up behind the reception desk, once considered the coldest interaction point. Now it's where little notes hang. Thank you for smiling at me. You listened when I spoke. I saw myself again. No one forced the hospital to do this. There was no formal announcement. But after the final training rounds of the Respect at Every Level program, staff did it themselves. Not out of trend, but because they didn't want to return to what was a place where people passed one another without even a glance. Since Linda left, no one really knows where she went. Some say she moved to another state. Others say she opened a community clinic in the mountains. But for those who had truly sat in her classes, who had looked into her eyes, they know Linda didn't leave. She simply shifted the light. No longer visible, but still present. Still felt in every quiet hallway, in every nod once withheld by routine indifference. Jaden is now the chief resident, but he still keeps his old office, a small room near the third-floor restroom. He doesn't want to move upstairs, not out of modesty, but because that was where Linda used to pass each night. On his desk is still a printed image from the basement camera. A moment where he's seen bending down to mop the floor, Tamika laughing, and Linda blurry in the background. No one knows when the camera snapped the shot, but Jaden believes Linda left it there on purpose. Megan, now the internal coordinator for interdepartmental training, begins each day by entering the listening room 10 minutes before her shift. She no longer looks for reasons to approve things. She looks for reasons to record them. In a private conversation with Jaden, she once said, I used to lead because I understood the system. Now I lead because I don't want to forget the voices it used to forget. Tamika, Elias, Aisha, and the logistics team. None of them got significant raises, but now they get mentioned by name. In a recent meeting, Elias was invited to give the opening talk on the role of engineering in post-op recovery. He didn't speak elegantly, but he ended with a sentence that silenced the entire room. I used to think I was the hospital's hidden arm behind its back. Now I know, without hands, no one mops the blood off the floor after surgery. One early morning, the front desk reported a small package had been delivered. No return address. Inside was a brown notebook, written in a familiar hand. If you're reading this, it means you still want to listen. Thank you for not choosing silence when silence was the easiest thing. No signature. But Jaden knew. Everyone knew. In a broader internal meeting, Harrow, now a policy advisor, was invited to speak. He stood before the auditorium, once his stage of dominance. Now he didn't need a mic. He spoke softly, clearly. I used to hold tightly to what I thought was authority. She held on to nothing, only gave. I've never heard anyone say so little and change so much. That's the greatest lesson I've ever received, and I owe her for the rest of my life. After he spoke, the auditorium fell silent. No applause, no music. Just the lights dimmed, as if bowing in reverence. That afternoon, as Jaden walked through the emergency wing, he saw a figure at the end of the hallway. Slightly hunched, pushing a cleaning cart, moving quietly. A silhouette he knew well, but when he ran toward her, only a brown headscarf hung on the supply room doorknob. Beneath it, a folded note. She still mops the floors, but now we all walk more gently. Linda didn't need to stay, because the system had begun to repair itself. Not perfect, but no longer silent, no longer blind in its steps. Every footstep now placed as if someone had once knelt down to clean that very floor, to teach others not to trample one another. At the far end of the hallway, a new painting was hung, drawn by the son of a nurse. In it is a misty hospital, small footprints pressed onto a white floor, and a woman holding a mop, standing in an unseen light. No face, no name, but everyone who walks by stops, not to ask, "Who is this?" but to whisper inwardly, "How many like her have I walked past and never noticed?" If you've ever been misjudged because of how you look, if you've ever suffered quietly in a system that wouldn't hear you, if you ever wish someone would step up, but had to rise on your own, then Linda's story is for you. Comment the name of someone who believed in you when no one else did, or the name of someone you quietly walked past but never looked back for. And if you want to keep telling the stories of the invisible, like, share, and subscribe, because we're rebuilding the system one story at a time.